November 1950. The frozen ridges north of the Changchun River. A Chinese colonel stands in the darkness, watching American convoys snake through the valley below, headlights blazing like they own the night. He turns to his commissar and laughs, a bitter, mocking sound that fogs in the cold air. Look at them. MacArthur's parade. They think this war is already over. They think we are peasants with sticks. He spits into the snow. They call us volunteers, like we are tourists. Let them come closer. Let them touch the Yalu. Then we will show them what happens when an empire forgets to look over its shoulder. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man leading that parade was already fighting a different war, one not against Chinese divisions, but against the cautious men in Washington who feared the very victory MacArthur promised to deliver. Douglas MacArthur didn't just want to defeat North Korea. He wanted to shatter the communist frontier, to roll back the red tide that had swallowed half of Asia, to prove that American will and American steel could redraw the maps that Yalta and Potsdam had sketched in cowardice. He had the Eighth Army, 8 divisions, 200,000 men, backed by the most powerful air force ever assembled over a single theater. He had the X-Corps landing at Wonsan, cutting the peninsula in half. He had tanks, artillery, napalm, and the absolute certainty that no peasant army, however numerous, could stand against modern American firepower. The plan was simple, elegant, inevitable. Drive north, crush the North Korean remnants, reach the Yalu River by Thanksgiving, and then, if the Chinese were foolish enough to intervene, pursue them across the border, bomb their supply lines in Manchuria, blockade their coast, and force Mao to sue for terms or watch his regime collapse under the weight of American industrial fury. The numbers sang to him. The B-29 superfortresses of the Far East Air Forces flew 1,200 sorties a week, dropping 5,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance on bridges, rail yards, and troop concentrations. The Eighth Army had 500 M4 Shermans and M26 Pershings, each one a rolling fortress with a 90mm gun that could punch through any armor the communists possessed. American pilots in F-80 Shooting Stars and F-51 Mustangs controlled the sky, strafing anything that moved, turning roads into graveyards of burning trucks. MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo received intelligence reports daily. Enemy forces shattered, morale broken, resistance collapsing. The war, by every metric that mattered, was won. All that remained was the final drive, the triumphal march to the border, and the political decision. Would Washington have the spine to finish what it started? But there were whispers, warnings that didn't fit the narrative of inevitable victory. CIA analysts noted massive troop movements across the Yalu, entire armies melting into the mountains. Patrols reported contact with Chinese soldiers, not North Koreans, men who spoke Mandarin, who wore quilted uniforms and carried Soviet rifles. MacArthur dismissed them as volunteers, a token force sent to save face, nothing that could alter the strategic picture. His intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, assured him that no more than 60,000 Chinese troops had crossed the border, a manageable nuisance. The general himself flew over the frozen landscape in his personal C-54, looking down at the empty roads, the silent forests, and saw nothing that troubled his certainty. The war is over, he told reporters. The boys will be home by Christmas. What he couldn't see, what aerial reconnaissance couldn't reveal, were the 300,000 Chinese soldiers dug into the hillsides, hidden in caves and ravines, moving only at night, cooking without fires, waiting with a patience that no American commander could fathom. They had marched for weeks, crossing the Yalu on submerged bridges that disappeared under the water at dawn, infiltrating through gaps in the UN lines, surrounding American positions without firing a shot. They carried 1 week's rations, maybe 2, and orders that were brutally simple. Let the enemy advance, then cut him off. Surround him, destroy him in detail. No retreat, no prisoners, no mercy for the imperialists who thought they could dictate terms on Chinese soil. MacArthur had promised Truman a quick victory, a decisive blow that would restore American prestige after the loss of China, that would prove containment was cowardice and that rollback was not only possible but necessary. He had told the Joint Chiefs that the Chinese wouldn't dare intervene, and if they did, American air power would turn the Yalu bridges into a killing zone, would slaughter any force foolish enough to cross. He had split his command, 8th Army on the west, X-Corps on the east, 100 miles of mountain between them, because he believed the enemy was beaten, because he wanted two columns racing for the river, because audacity had always worked before and caution was for lesser men. At 70 years old, Douglas MacArthur was fighting the last great campaign of his life, and he intended it to end not with negotiation or stalemate, but with total, unconditional victory. In Washington, the warnings grew louder. The Joint Chiefs reviewed the intelligence and saw a trap closing. They saw a UN force stretched across 400 miles of frozen mountain, supply lines vulnerable, units isolated, an enemy that had just swallowed Tibet without the world noticing. They drafted messages urging caution, suggesting consolidation, proposing a defensive line south of the narrow neck of the peninsula. But MacArthur was MacArthur, 5-star general, conqueror of Japan, hero of Incheon, and Truman, haunted by accusations of being soft on communism, hesitated to overrule the one commander who promised victory. The president sent emissaries, flew to Wake Island for a personal meeting, extracted assurances that everything was under control. MacArthur smiled, saluted, and flew back to Tokyo to plan the final offensive. The men on the ground felt it differently. Sergeants in the 2nd Infantry Division noticed that the North Korean prisoners they captured seemed almost relieved, like men who had just been pulled out of a fight they were losing. Patrols found fresh tracks in the snow, entire battalions moving parallel to American lines, disappearing before contact. Radio intercepts picked up unfamiliar call signs, coded traffic that didn't match North Korean procedures. At night, the listening posts heard sounds, thousands of footsteps, the creak of cart wheels, the low murmur of voices speaking a language that wasn't Korean. Platoon leaders reported it up the chain, and the reports were noted, filed, and ignored because they didn't fit the operational picture, because victory was so close you could taste it, because no one wanted to be the pessimist who questioned the great man's judgment. On November 24th, MacArthur launched the final offensive. 8th Army pushed north toward the Yalu, artillery hammering suspected enemy positions, infantry advancing through villages that stood empty and silent. The Chinese let them come. They watched from the ridgelines as American columns stretched out along the icy roads, watched as the distance between units grew, as the flanks went unguarded because there weren't enough men to cover the line and still maintain the advance. For 2 days, the Americans pushed forward, meeting only scattered resistance, and MacArthur's headquarters marked the progress with red arrows on the map, arrows that pointed straight to the river and the border beyond. Then, on the night of November 25th, the Chinese attacked. It came as a tidal wave of sound, bugles shrieking in the darkness, whistles, drums, and the roar of hundreds of thousands of voices shouting Shah, 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 kill, kill, kill. They hit the flanks first, overrunning positions that thought they were in reserve, surrounding units before they could react. They came in waves, human waves that absorbed machine gun fire and kept coming, stepping over their own dead to close with grenades and bayonets. American artillery fired until the barrels glowed red, then fired some more, killing thousands, and still they came. The Chinese attacked where the Americans were weakest, exploited every gap, infiltrated through lines that existed only on maps, and by dawn half the 8th Army was cut off, surrounded, fighting for survival. The 2nd Infantry Division tried to hold the road south from Conakry, to keep the escape route open. For 3 days they fought in temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero, fought through roadblocks and ambushes, fought until ammunition ran out and men froze to their weapons. Chinese soldiers appeared on ridges above the road, poured fire into the stalled convoys, turned a retreat into a massacre. Trucks burned, tanks were abandoned, entire battalions disintegrated. The division that had driven north with 15,000 men staggered south with less than 9,000. Leaving behind 4,000 casualties and every illusion of invincibility. A sergeant who survived would later write, "We walked into hell thinking we were gods. We walked out knowing we were just men, and not enough of us at that." MacArthur's response was immediate and apocalyptic. He requested authorization to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, to use nationalist troops from Taiwan, to blockade the Chinese coast, to pursue enemy forces across the Yalu regardless of boundaries or consequences. He told the Joint Chiefs that the restrictions placed on his command were crippling, that fighting a limited war against an unlimited enemy was suicide, that America could not win if it fought with one hand tied behind its back. He demanded reinforcements. 24 atomic bombs, he suggested, could sever Chinese supply lines and make a desert of Manchuria. He warned that without the authority to expand the war, without permission to strike at the source of enemy power, the UN forces in Korea faced not just defeat but annihilation. In Washington, the panic was real, but the conclusion was different. Truman and his advisors saw not an opportunity, but a catastrophe in the making. They saw a regional conflict metastasizing into World War III, saw Soviet forces pouring into Europe while American strength bled out in the Asian mountains, saw nuclear weapons being used not to end a war, but to start one that might end civilization. The Allies, British, French, Canadian, were horrified at MacArthur's proposals, threatened to withdraw their forces if the war expanded into China. The Joint Chiefs ran war games and concluded that attacking China would require total mobilization, would leave Europe defenseless, would commit America to a land war in Asia against an enemy with limitless manpower and Soviet backing. It was the one kind of war America couldn't win, the one scenario the strategists had nightmared about since 1945. But MacArthur would not accept limits. He believed, genuinely, furiously, that hesitation was cowardice, that the politicians who restrained him were betraying the men dying in the snow, that America's fear of escalation was precisely what emboldened the enemy. He had seen appeasement fail in the 1930s, had watched from Manila as the democracies handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler and called it peace. He would not repeat that mistake. He would not trade American lives for diplomatic niceties. He would not settle for stalemate when victory, total, crushing, final, was still within reach if only Washington would give him the tools and the authority to finish the job. The retreat continued. X-Corps, isolated on the eastern coast, fought its way south from the Chosin Reservoir in one of the most brutal withdrawals in American military history. The 1st Marine Division, 15,000 men, faced 10 Chinese divisions in terrain where the cold killed as efficiently as bullets, where frostbite claimed more casualties than combat, where men had to chip frozen bodies out of the ground to clear fields of fire. They fought for 17 days, 78 miles from Udamanai to Hungnam, every mile contested, every ridge a battle. But they brought their wounded, they brought their dead, and when they reached the sea, they had shattered 7 Chinese divisions and maintained unit cohesion. They had not been routed. They had not surrendered. A Marine colonel, asked if they were retreating, snarled into a microphone, "Retreat, hell. We're attacking in a different direction." It was magnificent. It was also irrelevant. The strategic picture was collapse. The 8th Army fell back 120 miles in 3 weeks, abandoning Pyongyang, abandoning the 38th parallel, abandoning every gain of the fall offensive. Seoul fell again in January. The Chinese poured south, convinced they could drive the Americans into the sea, that the imperialists were broken, and one more push would finish them. MacArthur requested permission to evacuate the peninsula entirely, to pull back to Japan and regroup, and when that was denied, he demanded again the authority to strike China, to use the full weight of American power without restriction or apology. Truman said no. He said no to bombing Manchuria. He said no to blockading China. He said no to nationalist reinforcements. He said no to atomic weapons. And in March 1951, when MacArthur publicly criticized the administration's strategy, when he sent a letter to a Republican congressman calling for victory over appeasement, when he essentially told the world that his commander-in-chief was a coward, Truman fired him. The announcement came on April 11, 1951. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of UN forces, was relieved of command and ordered home. The reaction was seismic. Republicans howled betrayal, accused Truman of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, demanded investigations and impeachment. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome, ticker tape parades, an address to Congress that brought grown men to tears. He spoke of duty and honor and country. of old soldiers who fade away, and the galleries erupted in applause that went on for minutes. He spoke as if the war in Korea were a noble crusade betrayed by timid politicians, as if American boys were dying for nothing because Washington lacked the will to win. But Matthew Ridgway, the general who replaced MacArthur, proved something that changed the entire calculus of the war. He proved that America didn't need to invade China to stop the Chinese. He proved that limited war, fought with discipline and firepower, could achieve strategic objectives without risking Armageddon. Within weeks of taking command in December 1950, before MacArthur's dismissal, Ridgway had stabilized the front. He reorganized the Eighth Army, restored unit cohesion, and implemented a doctrine that played to American strengths: artillery, air power, and the ability to move and supply forces faster than any army on Earth. He called it meat grinder warfare, and it was brutally simple. Let the Chinese attack. Channel them into kill zones. Saturate the ground with steel. Count the bodies. Advance when they're exhausted. Repeat. The Chinese discovered what the North Koreans had learned months earlier. You cannot outfight an enemy who can deliver 20,000 artillery rounds in an hour, who can call napalm strikes on your assembly areas before you even attack, who replaces losses overnight while your reinforcements take weeks to arrive. In February 1951, the Chinese launched their fourth phase offensive, throwing 500,000 men at the UN lines in human wave attacks that should have shattered any defense. American howitzers fired until the snow around them melted from the heat, fired proximity-fused shells that detonated above ground and side-downed entire companies with shrapnel. F-80 jets flew close air support missions in weather that should have grounded them, dropping 500-pound bombs on troop concentrations so dense that missing was impossible. The Chinese came in waves and died in waves, and when the offensive stalled after 2 weeks, they had lost 150,000 men and gained nothing. Ridgway counterattacked. Operation Killer, Operation Ripper, Operation Courageous. The names were blunt, unapologetic, and the operations matched. American forces advanced methodically, using terrain and firepower to minimize casualties, grinding north not for glory but for strategic position. By March, they had retaken Seoul. By April, they were back at the 38th parallel. The Marines who had fought their way out of Chosin were now pushing north again, taking the same hills they'd abandoned months before, and this time they weren't retreating. A Chinese prisoner, interrogated at a field hospital, stared at his captors with exhausted disbelief. "You have more bullets than we have men," he said quietly. "How do we fight that? How do we win when you can replace everything, and we cannot even feed our soldiers?" The industrial avalanche that MacArthur had wanted to unleash on China was already crushing the Chinese forces in Korea. American factories produced 50,000 artillery shells per day, and shipped them to Korea in quantities that turned logistics into theater strategy. The Eighth Army fired more ammunition in 1 month than the entire Wehrmacht fired in 6 months on the Eastern Front. American pilots flew 1,000 close air support sorties per week, each sortie delivering tons of ordnance with a precision that turned tactical positions into moonscapes. When a Chinese division dug into a ridgeline, American forward observers called in coordinates, and within 20 minutes the ridge ceased to exist as a defensive position, just smoke, rubble, and body parts scattered across snow that had turned black with explosives residue. The fuel moved was staggering. The U.S. military shipped 1.2 million gallons of gasoline and diesel to Korea every week, enough to keep trucks rolling, tanks advancing, aircraft flying in a logistical ballet that never stopped. Chinese forces, by contrast, moved at night on foot, carrying rice and ammunition on their backs, hiding from aircraft that owned the day. They dug tunnels, they dispersed, they camouflaged, and still they died because you cannot hide from an enemy who can saturate every square mile with steel. American artillery doctrine called for 10 rounds on a target to ensure destruction. In Korea, they fired 100 because they could, because the ammunition ships kept arriving, because overkill was cheaper than casualties. The pilot training gap became a chasm. American fighter pilots arrived in Korea with 500 hours of flight time, trained on instruments, trained in gunnery, trained in tactics that had been refined over 4 years of war against Germany and Japan. Chinese pilots, the few who made it into combat, had maybe 100 hours, often less, and flew Soviet MiG-15s they barely understood. When they engaged American F-86 Sabres over MiG Alley, near the Yalu, the kill ratio was 10-1, sometimes higher. American pilots used energy tactics perfected in World War II, boom and zoom, slashing attacks that used speed and altitude to negate the MiG's superior climb rate and turn performance. They hunted in pairs, covered each other, broke off when the odds were bad, and came back with wingmen when they found a target worth killing. Captain James Jabara became the first American jet ace on May 20th, 1951, shooting down his 5th and 6th MiGs in a single engagement. He described the fight in his after-action report with clinical precision. Engaged 4 MiG-15s at 25,000 feet, close to 1,000 feet, fired 200 rounds API into lead aircraft, observed strikes on fuselage and wing route. Aircraft entered uncontrolled spin and impacted terrain. Second MiG attempted reversal. I maintained energy advantage, fired 300 rounds at 800 feet. Canopy shattered, pilot ejected. Remaining MiGs disengaged north. 2 kills, 500 rounds, 3 minutes. The MiGs had been flown by Soviet pilots, instructors sent to train the Chinese, men who had survived the Great Patriotic War and thought they understood air combat. They learned the hard way that American pilots didn't just have better planes. They had better doctrine, better training, and an industrial base that replaced losses before the wreckage hit the ground. The Strategic Air Command added a new dimension of terror. B-29 superfortresses flew daylight raids against North Korean industry, transportation, and command centers, dropping thousands of tons of high explosive with a precision that turned cities into ruins. When Chinese anti-aircraft defenses began taking a toll, the bombers switched to night raids, using radar and pathfinders to hit targets in weather that grounded everything else. Pyongyang was bombed so thoroughly that post-war surveys found 75% of the city's structures destroyed. Hydroelectric dams along the Yalu, which power Manchurian industry as well as North Korean, were hit repeatedly, knocking out power to millions and crippling war production. The Chinese screamed about war crimes, about targeting civilians, and the Americans pointed out that every target hit was a military or industrial objective, that collateral damage was regrettable but inevitable, and that the raids would continue until the communists agreed to negotiate. By summer 1951, both sides were exhausted. The Chinese had lost perhaps 400,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or dead from disease and frostbite. The North Korean army had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. UN casualties were lighter, but still severe. 150,000 American casualties since June 1950, plus tens of thousands more from allied nations. The front had stabilized near the 38th parallel, roughly where it started, and neither side had the strength or will to break the stalemate. Truce talks began in July at Kaesong, then moved to Panmunjom, and immediately bogged down in procedural arguments, prisoner exchanges, and the central question that neither side wanted to answer. What had this war been for? MacArthur's vision, rollback, reunification, crushing the communist threat before it metastasized, was dead. Truman's policy, containment, limited war, deterrence without escalation, had won by default, but it felt like defeat. American soldiers died holding hills that would be traded away at the negotiating table. Pilots flew missions knowing their targets were restricted, that the real enemy infrastructure across the Yalu was off limits, that they were fighting with handcuffs that made victory impossible and stalemate permanent. The frustration was corrosive, the sense that politicians had betrayed the battlefield, that American power was being squandered by men too timid to use it. But Truman and his advisors understood something MacArthur never accepted, that nuclear powers cannot fight total wars without risking total annihilation, that limited objectives require limited means, that the goal in Korea was not conquest but credibility. The purpose of the war, unstated, barely acknowledged, was to prove that America would defend its allies, would bleed to stop communist expansion, would not retreat into isolationism or appeasement. It was a signal to Moscow, to Beijing, to every capital in Europe and Asia, watching to see if American guarantees meant anything. The cost was terrible. The result was ambiguous. But the alternative, MacArthur's war, expanded into China, possibly drawing in the Soviets, possibly going nuclear, was unthinkable. The enemy recognized it before MacArthur did. Chinese commanders, filing reports back to Beijing, described the American war machine not with contempt, but with a kind of horrified respect. One report, captured after an overrun headquarters, laid it out with brutal clarity. The American soldier is not superior individually. He is lazy. He complains. He requires luxuries we cannot imagine. But his system is superior. He has artillery that can fire all day without pause. He has aircraft that appear within minutes of a radio call. He has supply lines that never fail. When we destroy his vehicles, he has more vehicles the next day. When we kill his soldiers, more soldiers arrive before we can exploit the gap. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy who treats casualties as a logistics problem to be solved with production schedules. Another diary, found on the body of a Chinese battalion commander, was more succinct. We were told the Americans were cowards who would run when we attacked with revolutionary fervor. We attacked. They did not run. They called down thunder, and we died in the snow. Fervor does not stop bullets. Belief does not deflect shells. We have courage. They have factories. In the end, factories win. The air war provided the clearest scoreboard. By the end of 1951, American pilots had flown 700,000 combat sorties, a number so large it defied comprehension. They had destroyed 1,100 tanks, 800 locomotives, 9,000 vehicles, 1,200 bridges, and killed an estimated 184,000 enemy troops through close air support and interdiction. They had lost 1,466 aircraft to ground fire, mechanical failure, weather, and enemy action, but the loss rate was less than 0.2%, a testament to maintenance, training, and the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than they occurred. When an F-80 was shot down, another F-80 was already being uncrated at Kimpo or Taegu. When a B-29 didn't return, another crew was already training stateside. The enemy had no such depth, no such resilience. The final boss was not a weapon but a strategy. The realization that America didn't need to invade China to defeat Chinese objectives. The interdiction campaign turned North Korea into a logistical nightmare for the communists. Every bridge bombed was a supply line severed. Every rail yard destroyed was a division that couldn't be fed. American aircraft hunted truck convoys at night, using primitive infrared detectors and flares, turning roads into graveyards. The Chinese responded by moving everything at night, by dispersing supplies, by building dummy bridges and camouflaging real ones. It helped, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental math. America could deliver 100 tons of bombs for every ton of supplies the Chinese managed to move south. In November 1951, the UN launched Operation Rat Killer, a sweep through guerrilla-infested areas behind the lines. It wasn't glamorous. Small unit actions, coordinated search operations, intelligence gathering from villagers who were terrified of both sides. But it destroyed the communist logistics network in South Korea, eliminated the partisan threat, and secured the rear areas so thoroughly that supply convoys could move without escort. The operation killed or captured 11,000 guerrillas and broke the back of the insurgency. A captured North Korean officer, when asked why the partisans had failed, shrugged bitterly. Because you have helicopters. Because you have radios in every platoon. Because your soldiers are fed and ours are starving. Because you can be everywhere at once, and we can only be where we walk. The truce talks dragged on for 2 years. Men died for hills that had no names, no strategic value, nothing but symbolic importance to negotiators who measured concessions in blood. The Chinese launched offensives to improve their bargaining position. The Americans counterattacked to prove they couldn't be pressured. Artillery duels consumed thousands of shells per day over static positions that looked like Verdun reborn. It was ugly, attritional, demoralizing. Everything MacArthur had warned about, everything he said would happen if America fought a limited war. But the line held. It held through the spring offensives of 1952, through the hill fights that summer, through the final Chinese push in 1953 that tried and failed to break through before the armistice. It held because American firepower made offensive war suicidal, because close air support and artillery could shatter any concentration of troops before they reached the main line, because the logistical gap had become so vast that the Chinese couldn't sustain attacks long enough to matter. The war ended not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion, with both sides accepting that further fighting would change nothing, that the costs exceeded any conceivable benefit. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Total American casualties: 36,574 dead, 103,284 wounded, 4,820 captured, 8,177 missing. Chinese and North Korean casualties were never accurately counted, but estimates ranged from 1.5 to 3 million, a number so staggering that the disparity itself told the story. The 38th parallel remained the border, exactly where it had been in June 1950. Korea was still divided. Communism had not been rolled back. MacArthur's vision had died in the frozen hills and the cautious counsels of Washington. But something else had been proven. America had fought a limited war against a committed enemy and had not lost. It had demonstrated that containment worked, that aggression could be checked without escalation, that nuclear powers could clash through proxies without ending civilization. The cost was terrible. The outcome was ambiguous. But the alternative, the path MacArthur demanded, would have been worse. Today an F-86 Sabre sits in the Smithsonian, its silver skin polished, its guns silent. Beside it, a placard lists the kill ratio: 792 enemy aircraft destroyed, 78 American aircraft lost in air-to-air combat. 10 to 1. A docent tells visitors about the forgotten war, about the pilots who flew through flak and MiGs to hold a line that politicians drew on a map. Nearby, a Korean War memorial stands in the cold, statues of soldiers hunched against a wind that never stops. In a Chinese military archive, sealed for decades and only recently open to researchers, there's a report from a division commander dated August 1953. It's short, handwritten, brutally honest. We mocked them in November 1950. We called them weak, said they could not endure sacrifice, said they would break when we showed revolutionary fervor. We were wrong. They endured. They did not break. We fought them for 3 years, and we could not move them. Their will was not superior to ours, but their steel was endless. In the end, that was enough. The sky over Korea belonged to America, not through MacArthur's apocalyptic vision, but through the grinding, unglamorous superiority of logistics, firepower, and industrial might, the same combination that had won the last war and would define every war to come. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.